Hello, folks, and welcome back to Microsoft Project. This week we are talking about resources. Adding resources is our main topic for lesson 2, and we are going to start that this week. And so, a few things that you need to know to kind of wrap your mind around the concept of resources in terms of project management and how that's going to play out in Microsoft Project. So our main topics that I want to make sure you get from this and that you understand before you start trying to implement things in the software is that, as we talked about in the initiation phase, resources are the people, equipment, and stuff we need to get the job done. And the second thing is that it is extremely important to enter resource information properly in Microsoft Project. And that's why we're kind of taking it slow this week. Your resources are one of the biggest impacts on your budget, for example, for your project. And so we have to make sure that we're accounting for how we're using those resources the right way in order to get that correct budget number. And the two biggest factors in regards to resources that will affect your project getting done on time and within budget are, number one, the availability of those resources. As far as if Susie's working on one task, she can't be working on another task. And also the cost of using them. And there are different types of resources, and they get treated differently in Microsoft Project. And that's what I want to go through for you today. So we had talked a couple weeks ago about how there's several databases at play in Microsoft Project. And last week we learned how to enter our task information into our Gantt chart. So that includes the task duration, what tasks have to come before other tasks as far as those dependencies go and those task relationships and all that information about what needs to be done. And so this week we are going to be talking about those resources that are going to be used to do the task. And so you should recall from our kind of initial discussion of it that there's three databases. There's the task database, there's the resources database, and these are just my little symbols that I use for the resources. We're going to get to these in a minute. And then eventually what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to assign resources to tasks. So just kind of drawing a line and say, this is what's going to happen for each one of these tasks, and this is what we're going to use or who we're going to use to accomplish it. So this is the second database that we're working on this week. Okay, as I stated earlier, there are different types of resources. And when you think through, planning your own project or event or something like that in your head, it's going to make a lot of sense as far as the different types of resources that we can use to get the job done. Probably the number one type of resource that we think of for an everyday task is people. So people do the work, right? Somebody is in charge of this thing that needs to be done to get our project done. Another thing that we have to use in order to accomplish tasks within our project is equipment, and that is another kind of resource. So this could be, for example, a dump truck or a cement mixer. If you're thinking about a construction project, it can't be two different places at once. We have to make sure that we are accounting for it and that it's available. Our next type of resource is material resource, and I have this little Pac-Man to represent that. Those are the resources that get used up. So he's eating up the little pellets of food, and those don't come back. So material resources would be things like bricks, for example, that you are going to use to build a house, but you can't reuse those, unlike equipment resources, which can be used again and again. And then finally, we have a category called cost resources. And I'm going to get into it in a little more detail in the next few slides, but cost resources are those things that cost money, but don't really fit into any of the other categories, but we still need to account for them within our budget. In Microsoft Project, it's very important to remember that what we think of as people and equipment, so this is my, obviously, person icon over here, and this one is some kind of a machine. Hopefully it's a very abstract looking conveyor belt or a robot or something. Those people and equipment are going to be treated the same as each other in Microsoft Project. So people resources is just who is doing what. Like I said before, is Bob working on this or is Sue working on this? And what's really important to remember when we're talking about people resources are a few factors. And the first one is availability. When are they available? Can they spend all of their time this week on this task, or are they splitting their time between two different tasks? Are they going to be on vacation? Do we have to make sure that we are not assigning work when they're going to be out of the office? That's another big factor for people. The next big factor for people resources is how much you're paying them. So in most project scenarios, you are going to have people in a workforce. Sometimes you'll have volunteers who you don't pay, but in our case, when we're going through our book project, we have to think of the wages that we are paying people per hour or per week. Maybe we're hiring a contractor for a 3-month period of time, something like that. So we have to take into account how much we are paying those people because that's going to affect our budget. If somebody makes $20 an hour versus $15 an hour and they're working on a task for a week, well, the person that we pay $20 an hour, it costs more for them to be working on that task that week instead of the person who gets paid less. And that is ultimately going to affect our budget for the project. Other things to consider about people in Microsoft Project, we can assign things to an individual. It can just be Janice. Janice is working on this task, but you don't necessarily have to put a person's name in there either. It can be, head of marketing or something like that. But it can also be a team, and it could be the entire marketing department is working on a particular task for a week. And we are going to get into how we account for the difference between how we show that just one person is working on it versus like 3 people are working on it, because it might take less time if there's multiple people working on it. So yep, that's kind of a summary of the different considerations for people resources. And then equipment resources. So I stated before that equipment and people are going to be looked at sort of the same in Microsoft Project, but some things that we need to consider for equipment. This would be machines, vehicles. I put robots on there because I like to think of Rosie from the Jetsons. She did a lot of work around the Jetsons home, so she's not a person, but she's a piece of equipment. But equipment, our considerations are also availability. For example, if you're running a bakery and you have so many loaves of bread to make a day, but you only have one stand mixer that can handle the dough, well, it's going to be busy working on making your sweet dough, and then you can't make your bagel dough at the same time. So it's going to affect whether we can work on tasks at the same time if we only have one piece of equipment available that needs to be worked on or needs to be used to work on 2 different tasks. So that's something to consider to kind of wrap your mind around the kind of equipment. And then there's also this factor with equipment that which we maybe don't think about in every day so much, but there is an operational cost to run various pieces of equipment. So, and this can be to just kind of wrap your mind around what this might be. It could be operating costs. So, for example, if you have like a dump truck or a cement mixer, like I alluded to earlier, it doesn't seem like, oh, you don't have to pay every time you use it. But when you think about it, you really do because you have to pay for fuel, operation costs for that truck to run, right? Also, there's certain kinds of equipment that incur some maintenance cost per hour or per day that they are running. And it's kind of spread out over time. So this isn't something that we run into every day, but for a large like manufacturing plant or large construction company, this would be something that they would work into their project budget and their project costs that actually are incurred as they use that piece of equipment. So you can imagine that if you did have some big industrial cement mixer, and you ran a construction company, not only do you have a per hour fuel cost that it takes to just run the engine, so whatever the going rate is for diesel fuel, times the fuel efficiency of that vehicle, but then also over time, every 1 month or so, they might have to bring it down out of rotation, and they have to do some maintenance on it, and then there's like costs associated with that as far as paying the mechanics to do that maintenance, for parts, lubricants like oil or whatever the case may be that they would incur for that as well. Costs for equipment can also be rental fees. So if you don't actually own the piece of equipment and you have to rent it, then that can be a cost that you would want to account for in your project as well. And so once again, I just want to make sure that you understand this concept that in Microsoft Project land, people and equipment resources, even though we think of them very differently, because they have so many similarities, they are all under this topic of work resources. And that's what we call both people and equipment in Microsoft Project is work resources. And when you think about it, they both do the work to finish a task. They both use time up. So in contrast to some of our other resource categories, it matters how much time the equipment is running, and it matters how much time the people are putting in for their paycheck every week. They have this factor of availability that's very important for each one of them. Not one piece of equipment and one person can't really be working on two different tasks on the same time, even though we think we can sometimes, but really we can't. And they both incur a cost as you use them. So for every hour or day or week that a person or a piece of equipment is assigned to a task, then it's going to cost the business more and more and more. So that all needs to go into the project budget. So just remember that people and equipment are both accounted for in Microsoft Project as work resources. Keyword. Okay, let's move on to Pac-Man, our little material resources here. So what's the difference between an equipment resource and a material resource? Because they're both things, but they're treated very differently. And when you think about it, they affect your project differently. Material resources are stuff that gets used up, and that's why little Mr. Pac-Man here is eating up little pellets to remind you that that's what material resources are. This is stuff that gets used up in the course of a project. So, for example, if you're building a house, this would be bricks. You start with 3,000 bricks and you use them all up. Paper, if it's a print job or something like that, paper gets used up. Ink, paint, if you're painting a house, that paint, you have to purchase it and then you use it and then it's gone and you can't reuse that. So factors that we want to consider is how much of that material or how many of that material do we have and how many do we need. And project is going to help us estimate that a little bit. And at what rate are they used up? There's certain material resources that are kind of finite, like how many bricks you need to build a house. But there's also material resources that you're just going to continue using throughout the course of a project. That's kind of an infinite. You're going to use it for as long as you're doing a task. And we're going to get in very great detail on that later. So that's material resources. And our final category of resources is cost resources. This one's a little bit tricky and it's a little weird to think of, but I kind of alluded to it a little bit before. This is stuff you spend money on, but it doesn't really help you do the tasks. It's something that is going to have to be added into your budget for the project, but it's not really helping with the work in the way that the equipment or the material might be. So some examples of this are travel expenses. So if part of your project involves traveling to a certain location or maybe flying in a contractor that needs to work on part of the task, that money that you're spending on the plane ticket isn't really helping you with a particular task, but it is part of the overall budget for the project. So we have to account for it somewhere. Another example of this is food. And this would be like if in your planning for your project, you are going to celebrate at the end of a milestone with a big lunch for everybody who's been involved. That lunch money isn't really helping you do any of the work in the project, but it's falling under the umbrella of how we need to account for the expenses for the project. Another one for this is things like fees or permits that we have to buy in order to accomplish our project. Again, It's not really helping us with a particular task. It's not doing any work. It's not getting used up, but it is something that we have to account for. You can just think of it as a financial obligation, and that's why it's called a cost resource, and that's why the symbol for it is just a dollar sign. It's something that we just have to pay. Another thing to think about is that it doesn't really depend on scheduling or duration in terms of, it doesn't have all those other factors that are going to make it really like a complex thing within our project. It's just something that we gotta pay. So again, the 3 types of resources are available in Microsoft Project are number 1, work resources, and that's people, equipment, robots. Material resources, stuff that gets used up. And cost resources, things that we just have to pay for. Some of the ways that you can assess which category a resource might fall under, some questions that you can ask yourself. If you're trying to figure out whether something is a work resource or not, you can ask yourself the questions, do we have to schedule a time to use it or for it to work? You wouldn't have to schedule a time for a pile of bricks to work, but if you are talking about a dump truck and it had to be on the job site during a certain time to get a task accomplished, yes, it does have a scheduled time. So you would know that bricks are not a work resource, but a dump truck is. And also, do we have to pay to use it by the hour, day, or week? So that's a really easy way to kind of discern something that would be a work resource. Is it a material resource? Here's a question that you can ask yourself if you're trying to figure out whether something is a material resource, and that is, does it get used up? So that pile of bricks definitely gets used up in the course of making your house. So that would be an example of a material resource. Whereas the dump truck can work all day and it's still there at the end of the day. That's not a material resource. And questions to ask to think about whether something is a cost resource or not. You can ask the question, is it an extra cost that we just have to pay? Just one of those cost of doing business kind of things. And in that case, it is a cost resource. You can also ask yourself when it comes to cost resources, if you go through the process of thinking, is it a work resource? No. Is it a material resource? No. Then it might be a cost resource. Okay, so that is our little introductory video about the different types of resources in Microsoft Project in the course of your project. And of course, I don't have it on this slide, but these people and equipment resources, remember, always go together, and those are always work resources. So I hope this sets the stage for your learning this week. It's really important to be able to differentiate when you're planning a project what type of resource each one of these is, because the way that we enter the data for these resources is going to be just a little different, and we're going to have to take in some extra considerations that we're going to have to add into our project depending on which type of resource it is. So you really have to be able to think through this critically in order to set your project up in the right way. Okay, I hope that was helpful, and take care.